The stew was still cooling in their bowls when James and Rebecca Thompson vanished from their farmhouse on the edge of Cedar Falls, Idaho. It was the evening of October 5, 1973, a Friday when autumn had just settled into the Bitterroot Valley, painting the mountains in amber and gold and wrapping the scattered farms in wood smoke and stillness. Their neighbor across the fence line, Helen Crow, glanced through her kitchen window around 10:12 and saw the Thompsons' kitchen light still burning, the faint murmur of their radio drifting through the cool mountain air. On the dining table, she could just make out 2 plates waiting, steam no longer rising, and the coffee percolator still plugged into the wall. By morning, every door was locked from the inside. The truck sat untouched in the driveway. When Helen knocked at dawn, no one answered. What unfolded in the decades that followed would become one of the most chilling mysteries in Idaho history, a case that wouldn't be solved until the earth itself gave up its secrets. Before we go further into this case, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss the latest investigations. October 1973. Cedar Falls, a quiet farming town of roughly 2,400 souls tucked against the Bitterroot Mountains in northern Idaho, still moved at the unhurried pace of a community built on timber, faith, and routine. James Thompson, 51, a machinery foreman at the Clearwater pulp mill, was a man of discipline and precision, known among his crew for his unshakable sense of order and quiet reliability. His wife, Rebecca, 49, had once taught elementary school before devoting herself to her garden, her baking, and the Sunday service teas she hosted for the church ladies. They had 2 children, Linda, 27, married and living in Boise, and Michael, 22, who had recently moved to Oregon after a brief stint at a community college. The Thompsons lived in a modest single-story farmhouse on Willow Creek Lane, surrounded by open fields and stands of pine where morning fog clung low and thick. To neighbors and church friends, they were the embodiment of small-town decency, hard-working, dependable, and quietly unremarkable. On Friday evening, October 5, temperatures dropped sharply as darkness came early to the valley, and a hush settled over Cedar Falls as porch lights flickered on one by one and the smell of dinner mingled with the smoke from wood stoves. Sometime after 9, Helen Crow noticed the kitchen light still glowing at the Thompson place, the curtains slightly parted, the table set as if frozen mid-meal. She thought nothing of it at first, just neighbors finishing a late supper, but the stillness felt different somehow. The radio played softly. The house gave off no movement, no shadows crossing behind the glass. Hours passed. The light stayed on. Helen went to bed thinking they must have simply left it burning. The next morning, around 8:45, Helen stepped onto her porch and saw the scene unchanged. The truck was still there. The kitchen light still on. The curtains untouched. She walked across the gravel drive and knocked gently on the front door. No answer. She knocked harder. Nothing. She circled to the back, calling out their names, her voice carrying across the empty yard. The mudroom door was locked. Through the window, she could see James' coat still hanging on the hook, Rebecca's gardening gloves resting on the counter. She peered through the kitchen window again. 2 bowls of stew sat exactly where they'd been the night before, a loaf of bread with 2 slices missing, the coffee still in its pot. Everything looked lived in, yet utterly abandoned. By mid-morning, Helen's unease had turned to alarm. She drove into town and found the sheriff's department, her hands trembling as she explained what she'd seen, or rather, what she hadn't. By noon, deputies were walking through the eerily quiet farmhouse, noting every detail with growing bewilderment: doors locked from within, no forced entry, no signs of struggle, no indication of departure. Just a house. Suspended in time, as though James and Rebecca Thompson had simply ceased to exist mid-evening, leaving behind only the echo of their ordinary lives. And for nearly half a century, that's exactly how it would remain, until a young couple, a jackhammer, and a cold cellar floor brought the past roaring back to life. But to understand how a family could disappear so completely, we need to go back to that autumn evening when time stopped in Cedar Falls, back to the smell of stew and tobacco, the crackle of a radio playing gospel songs, and the kind of October stillness that settles over small mountain towns like a held breath. October 5, 1973. Friday evening. The sun had dipped behind the Bitterroot Peaks just after 6, leaving the valley bathed in that particular amber light that only comes in early fall. Leaves, gold and rust and deep crimson, clung stubbornly to the cottonwoods lining Willow Creek Lane, and wood smoke curled lazily from chimneys across Cedar Falls. The air smelled of pine resin and damp earth, of harvest and the coming cold. Porch lights blinked on one by one as families settled into their evening routines, dinner on the stove, children's homework spread across kitchen tables, the low murmur of television sets filtering through curtained windows. At the Thompson farmhouse, a single-story structure with faded white paint and a sagging front porch, the kitchen light glowed warm against the gathering darkness. Inside, 2 bowls of beef stew sat waiting on the dining table, steam rising in gentle wisps. A loaf of bread, homemade, still warm from the oven, rested on a wooden cutting board with 2 thick slices missing. The coffee percolator burbled softly on the counter, filling the small kitchen with its rich, bitter aroma. Rebecca's yellow apron hung on its usual hook beside the pantry. James' work jacket, canvas, worn smooth at the elbows, draped over the back of his chair. The radio on the windowsill played quietly, a gospel program from the station in Lewiston, the preacher's voice rising and falling in practiced rhythm. Everything looked normal. Everything looked lived in. But no one was eating. James Thompson, 51 years old and built like the machinery he worked with, solid, dependable, precise, should have been sitting at the head of that table. He was a man who lived by routine the way some men lived by religion. Up at 5:30 every morning. Coffee black, 2 cups. At the mill by 7 o'clock. Home by 5:15, never later. Dinner at 6:30, always at 6:30. He'd worked as a machinery foreman at the Clearwater pulp mill for nearly 2 decades, supervising the massive grinders and digesters that turned Idaho timber into paper. His co-workers knew him as fair but exacting, a man who tolerated no shortcuts and kept his tools organized with almost military precision. He wasn't warm, exactly, but he was steady, and in a town like Cedar Falls, steady counted for more than charm. Rebecca Thompson, 49, had a gentler presence. She'd taught 3rd grade at Cedar Falls Elementary for 12 years before leaving the classroom to focus on home and family. Her former students, now grown, some with children of their own, still spoke fondly of Mrs. Thompson's patient explanations and the way she'd kept a jar of peppermints on her desk for anyone who needed encouragement. These days, she poured that same nurturing energy into her garden, her church activities, and the Sunday service teas she hosted in the small sitting room where doilies covered every surface and photographs of Linda and Michael smiled from their frames. She baked bread every Thursday. She kept the house immaculate. She hummed while she worked. To anyone looking in from the outside, the Thompsons were unremarkable in the best possible way, the kind of couple that formed the quiet backbone of communities like Cedar Falls. But that Friday evening, something had shifted. Across the fence line, separated by maybe 40 yards of dried grass and a stretch of gravel drive, Helen Crow stood at her kitchen sink washing the last of her dinner dishes. At 74, Helen was a retired nurse with sharp eyes, sharper instincts, and the habit of paying attention, a habit born from decades of watching for symptoms, for changes, for the small details that might mean everything. Her kitchen window faced directly toward the Thompson property, and over the years, she'd become attuned to their rhythms. She knew when James' truck pulled in each evening. She knew the sound of Rebecca's voice calling to the stray cats she fed behind the barn. She knew when their lights went off at night, usually by 10 o'clock, rarely later. So when Helen glanced up at 10:12 p.m. and saw the Thompson kitchen still brightly lit, she paused. Through the window, partially obscured by the thin curtains Rebecca favored, she could see the dining table. 2 plates. 2 bowls. The shapes unmistakable even at this distance. But no movement. No shadows crossing behind the glass. No flicker of someone walking past. The radio was still playing. She could hear it faintly, carried on the cool night air. Helen dried her hands on her apron and stepped out onto her back porch, squinting into the darkness. The Thompson house sat quiet in its pool of yellow light. The truck was parked where it always was. The mudroom door was closed. Everything looked exactly as it should. Except for the stillness. Helen had lived alone since her husband Walter passed 6 years earlier, and she'd grown accustomed to the particular quality of an empty house, the way silence settles differently when no one else is breathing the same air. And standing there on her porch, looking at the lit windows of the Thompson farmhouse, she felt that same emptiness radiating across the yards between them. She shook her head, told herself she was being foolish. They'd probably just gone to bed and forgotten to turn off the kitchen light. It happened. People got tired. She went back inside, locked her door, and climbed the stairs to her bedroom. But sleep came slowly, and when it did, it brought uneasy dreams. Morning arrived cold and clear, frost sparkling on the grass like scattered diamonds. Helen woke at 6:30, her body still keeping hospital hours decades after leaving the profession, and went through her morning ritual: coffee, toast, the newspaper she'd picked up from her mailbox the evening before. By 8 o'clock, she'd finished breakfast and moved to the kitchen to start on her weekly baking. That's when she glanced out the window again. The Thompson house looked exactly the same as it had the night before. The kitchen light still on. The curtains still parted. The truck still in the driveway. Helen set down her coffee cup and stared. It was Saturday morning. James should have been out by now. He usually spent Saturday mornings tinkering in the barn or working on whatever project needed attention. Rebecca should have been in her garden, even in October, checking on the last stubborn tomatoes or pulling weeds from the flower beds. But the house just sat there, unchanged, as though frozen in the exact moment Helen had last seen it. She pulled on her coat and walked across the gravel drive, her breath misting in the morning air. The closer she got, the stranger it felt. No sounds from inside. No movement. Just that persistent golden glow from the kitchen window and the very faint hum of the radio, still playing. Helen knocked on the front door. Gently at first, then harder. James? Rebecca? Nothing. She tried the doorknob. Locked. She walked around to the back, her shoes crunching on the frost-stiff grass. The mudroom door, also locked. She cupped her hands against the window and peered inside. James' work jacket still hanging there. Rebecca's gardening gloves on the counter, dirt-stained fingers curled like empty hands. The keys to the truck hanging on their brass hook, catching the light. Rebecca. Her voice was louder now, edged with worry. James, are you in there? Silence answered. Helen circled the entire house, checking every window, every door, calling their names until her throat felt raw. Everything was locked. Everything was untouched. And through the kitchen window, she could still see those 2 bowls of stew, the steam long gone, the coffee in its pot, the bread on its board. By 9:30, Helen's hands were shaking. She drove into town, her old Ford rattling over the dirt road, and headed straight for the sheriff's department, a squat brick building next to the post office where Sheriff Thomas Garland kept office hours 6 days a week. She found him at his desk, reading incident reports and drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Helen. He looked up, surprised. Everything all right? It's the Thompsons, she said, and heard the tremor in her own voice. Something's wrong. Within an hour, Sheriff Garland and 2 deputies stood on the Thompsons' front porch. One of the deputies, a young man named Pete Corrigan who'd grown up 3 houses down from the Thompsons, knocked hard enough to rattle the door in its frame. No response. We're going to have to go in, Garland said quietly. Pete fetched a crowbar from the patrol car. The lock on the back mudroom door gave way with a sharp crack, and the 3 men stepped inside. The house felt wrong immediately, not cold, exactly, but emptied, as though something vital had been extracted from the air itself. The radio was still playing softly in the kitchen, a hymn now, the woman's voice sweet and plaintive. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Everything else was still. Sheriff Garland moved slowly through the rooms, his trained eyes cataloging every detail. In the kitchen, 2 bowls of stew, the contents congealed and gray now. A loaf of bread. Coffee in the percolator, he touched the side, completely cold. Fresh laundry folded in a basket near the pantry. Rebecca's reading glasses on the counter. A grocery list in her handwriting, milk, flour, stamps. In the living room, the evening newspaper from Friday, folded neatly on the side table. James' reading chair, the cushion still holding the faint impression of his weight. A book, something about World War II, marked with a receipt halfway through. In the bedroom, the bed made with hospital corners, Rebecca's style. Both nightstands bearing reading materials. James' watch on the dresser. Rebecca's church dress hanging on the closet door, freshly pressed. No overturned furniture. No broken glass. No blood. No signs of forced entry anywhere in the house except the door they'd just broken down. No signs of struggle. No signs of departure. Just this peculiar preservation, as though the Thompsons had been interrupted midlife and simply vanished. Deputy Corrigan stood in the kitchen doorway, his face pale. "Sheriff, it's like they just stopped existing." Garland walked back to the dining table and stared at those 2 bowls of stew. He'd been in law enforcement for 23 years. He'd seen suicides, accidents, domestic violence, and every variation of human tragedy that could unfold in a rural county. But he'd never seen anything quite like this. "Check the barn," he said quietly. "Check the cellar. Check every inch of this property." The deputies fanned out. Garland reached over and switched off the radio. The silence that followed felt heavier than any sound. He stood alone in the Thompson kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of ordinary lives interrupted, the stew and the bread and the coffee, the apron on its hook and the jacket on its chair, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. The house felt frozen, as though time had stopped, and taken James and Rebecca with it. By Sunday morning, Cedar Falls had mobilized. Sheriff Garland stood in the parking lot of the First Baptist Church, the largest open space in town, and watched as nearly 200 volunteers assembled in clusters, their breath misting in the cold dawn air. Farmers in work boots and flannel. Housewives in practical coats. Mill workers who'd taken the day off. Even Pastor Hendricks had closed Sunday service early, urging his entire congregation to join the effort. "We'll divide into quadrants," Garland announced, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Group 1 takes the woods behind the Thompson property, follow the tree line north toward Blacktail Creek. Group 2, you're searching the fields east toward the highway. Group 3, check every abandoned structure, every shed, every barn within a 2-mile radius. Group 4, you're walking the creek bed south to where it meets the Clearwater." He paused, scanning the sea of worried faces. "Look for clothing, personal items, signs of disturbance, anything that doesn't belong. If you find something, don't touch it. Mark the location and radio immediately." The search lasted 3 days. Volunteers combed through dense stands of pine and Douglas fir, calling out the Thompsons' names until their voices went hoarse. They waded through icy creek water, checking beneath fallen logs and behind rock formations. They searched every deer trail, every logging road, every path that led away from Willow Creek Lane. Bloodhounds brought in from Lewiston tracked scents that went nowhere, circling the farmhouse, sniffing at the truck, then sitting confused in the driveway as though the trail simply ended. They found nothing. No footprints leading into the woods. No torn fabric caught on branches. No blood in the grass or disturbed earth that might indicate a burial. No tire tracks except those belonging to the Thompsons' own truck and Helen Crow's Ford. The highway patrol stopped cars traveling through the area, asking drivers if they'd seen anything unusual Friday night or Saturday morning. No one had. By Monday evening, exhaustion and bewilderment had settled over the search teams like fog. "It's like they evaporated," said Tom Birch, who owned the feed store and had known James Thompson for 15 years. He stood beside the creek, mud caked on his boots, staring at nothing. A man and his wife don't just vanish into thin air. But that's exactly what seemed to have happened. The whispers started almost immediately, quiet at first, then gaining momentum as the search dragged on without answers. In the aisles of Hanson's general store, at the mill during shift changes, in the hushed conversations after church services, theories began to multiply like weeds. Maybe they ran off together. Started a new life somewhere. Don't be ridiculous. James Thompson wouldn't abandon his job. Not in a million years. What about money troubles? Debts? They weren't wealthy, but they weren't desperate either. And you don't run from debts without taking your truck. Could be something darker. Abduction. Someone they knew. Or didn't know. Could have been drifters passing through. The more dramatic theories emerged in taverns and late-night kitchen conversations: involvement with religious cults, secret affairs, witness protection, government conspiracies. Some claimed Rebecca had been acting strange in the weeks before, distant, preoccupied. Others swore James had been seen arguing with someone at the mill, though no one could agree on who or when. None of it was supported by evidence. All of it was repeated anyway. Sheriff Garland conducted interviews methodically, starting with family. Rebecca's older sister, Margaret Hollis, drove up from Boise on Monday afternoon. She sat in Garland's office, twisting a tissue in her hands, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "Rebecca would never leave without telling me," she said firmly. "We talked every Sunday. Every single Sunday for 30 years. Did she seem worried about anything recently?" Garland asked gently. "Any problems at home?" Margaret hesitated, and in that ND stored in the basement of the courthouse alongside decades of other unsolved cases. The Thompson farmhouse stood empty through that winter. Linda couldn't bear to enter it. Michael never came back from Oregon to claim anything. Eventually, the county took possession for unpaid taxes, and the house was sold at auction to a family from Montana who lasted 8 months before moving away, claiming the place felt wrong. Over the years, it changed hands twice more, but never for long. Most of the time it sat vacant, windows dark, porch sagging, weeds reclaiming the yard where Rebecca's roses had once bloomed. And on clear October nights, when the air turned sharp and wood smoke drifted through the valley, Helen Crow would stand at her kitchen window and stare at the old Thompson place. Sometimes the porch light flickered, a loose connection, probably, or faulty wiring. But to Helen, it always looked like a signal. Like the house was still waiting. Still holding its breath. Still keeping whatever secrets had frozen time that autumn evening in 1973. Time moves differently in small towns, slower in some ways, faster in others. Seasons blur together. Children grow up and move away. Old buildings sag and fade. But certain stories, certain places, refuse to be forgotten. The Thompson farmhouse became one of those places. Between 1973 and 2018, the property changed hands 5 times, though calling it ownership felt generous. Most buyers lasted less than a year before putting it back on the market, citing vague reasons: too much work, too isolated, not what they expected. But the real reason, whispered over coffee at Hanson's general store or during Sunday services at First Baptist, was always the same. The house felt wrong. The first family after the county auction, the Mercers from Montana, moved in with optimism and fresh paint. They lasted 8 months. Mrs. Mercer told her sister that she'd wake in the night hearing footsteps in the kitchen, the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing. When she'd go downstairs to check, everything would be still. But the radio, the same radio Rebecca Thompson had kept on the windowsill, would sometimes turn on by itself, crackling with static and fragments of gospel songs that hadn't been broadcast in decades. Her husband dismissed it as old wiring. She wasn't so sure. They left in June of 1975, taking a loss on the property. A young couple tried next in 1979. They made it 3 months. Then an elderly widower in 1984 who died of natural causes within the year, though neighbors swore he'd seemed frightened those last few weeks, muttering about voices in the cellar. By the 1990s, the house stood vacant more often than not. The paint peeled. The porch sagged. Weeds swallowed Rebecca's garden, and the barn leaned at an increasingly dangerous angle. Teenagers dared each other to spend nights there, though few made it past midnight. They'd come running out claiming they heard whispering through the walls, or felt cold drafts in rooms with no windows open, or saw shadows moving where no person stood. Local real estate agents stopped showing the property. It became cheaper to let it sit empty than to deal with the inevitable complaints. Cedar Falls itself evolved around the frozen house on Willow Creek Lane. The mill shut down in 1987, victim to changing markets and environmental regulations. New strip malls appeared along the highway. A Walmart opened in 1995. Young families moved in, drawn by affordable land and mountain views, knowing nothing of the Thompsons except what older residents mentioned in passing. But even newcomers learned quickly. The house had a reputation that transcended generations. "That's the place where that couple disappeared," people would say, driving past on their way to the creek. Back in the 70s. Just vanished. Never found them. And the story would be told again, abbreviated now, smoothed by repetition, about the untouched dinner and the locked doors and the inexplicable absence. Details shifted over the years, embellished or forgotten. But the essential mystery remained. The Thompson children became mysteries of their own. Michael Thompson had been 22 when his parents disappeared, old enough to inherit, old enough to be questioned, old enough to bear the weight of suspicious glances. Sheriff Garland had interviewed him by phone in late October 1973. Michael had been living in Portland then, working construction, and claimed he hadn't been back to Cedar Falls in months. His alibi checked out. He attended no memorial service, because there were no bodies to memorialize. He never returned to claim possessions from the house. Over the years, Michael drifted further into obscurity. He finished a degree in mechanical engineering at Portland State, worked for a series of manufacturers, and eventually settled in Eugene. Those who encountered him, co-workers, neighbors, the woman at the coffee shop he visited every Tuesday, described him the same way: quiet, competent, utterly unremarkable. He never married. He kept to himself. He never, ever spoke about his family. Linda, the daughter who'd discovered the empty house that Saturday morning, had struggled more visibly. She'd divorced her husband Richard in 1976, moved to Seattle, remarried in 1981, and changed her name to Linda Marshall. She'd seen therapists, joined support groups for families of missing persons, and eventually found a measure of peace by simply refusing to discuss it. When her own children asked about their grandparents, she'd say only, "They're gone. That's all I know." She died of cancer in 2014, never having learned what happened that October night. But it was the third name in the file, initially overlooked, barely mentioned in the original investigation, that would eventually matter most. Elaine. Elaine Thompson, Michael's older sister, had been 26 in 1973, already married and living in Boise with her husband, a CPA named Robert Dennison. She'd been interviewed briefly after the disappearance, had provided nothing useful, and had subsequently vanished into the comfortable anonymity of suburban life. She and Robert had 2 daughters. She worked part-time at the Boise Public Library, eventually becoming a children's librarian beloved by the families who frequented the reading room. She baked cookies for school fundraisers. She volunteered at her church. She kept a tidy house with seasonal wreaths on the door and perennials in the yard. Those who knew Elaine Dennison described her as intelligent, disciplined, soft-spoken, and almost preternaturally calm, the kind of person who seemed incapable of being rattled. She never spoke publicly about her parents' disappearance. Not once in 45 years. 300 miles north, in the Idaho Cold Case Bureau's cramped offices in Coeur d'Alene, Detective Sarah Hale kept a photograph pinned to her cubicle wall. It showed the Thompson farmhouse as it had looked in 1973, white paint still fresh, porch still straight, garden still blooming. Beside it, she'd tacked newspaper clippings, case summaries, and a hand-drawn timeline she'd created herself. Sarah had been 7 years old when the Thompsons disappeared. Her family had lived in Cedar Falls then, and she remembered the fear that had gripped the town, the way parents had suddenly become vigilant, the way people locked doors that had never been locked before. She remembered her mother mentioning it at dinner, her voice hushed, just vanished. Right out of their own home. That story had burrowed into young Sarah's imagination and never left. She'd joined the Idaho State Police at 23, made detective at 30, and transferred to the Cold Case Bureau at 35 specifically because of cases like this one, unsolved disappearances that haunted communities for generations. The Thompson case wasn't officially hers. She had no authorization to investigate it. But she studied it anyway, during lunch breaks and late evenings, reading through the original reports, noting the gaps and inconsistencies. The cellar concrete that Sheriff Garland had noticed but never pursued. The vague tensions between James and his son that no one had fully explored. The fact that both adult children had alibis but neither had seemed particularly eager to search for their missing parents. Small details. Probably meaningless. But Sarah had learned that sometimes the smallest details were the ones that mattered most. She'd requested the file be digitized, cross-referenced with modern databases, kept active in the system even though the case was decades cold. She'd marked it for review if any new evidence ever emerged. And then she'd waited. Because Sarah Hale understood something that Sheriff Garland hadn't quite grasped back in 1973, standing in that cold cellar staring at concrete that looked too new. Sometimes, the dead don't stay hidden. They wait. They wait for the earth to shift, for renovations to begin, for jackhammers to break through the barriers that have kept them silent. They wait for time to pass and memories to fade and for the people who buried them to grow careless or old or convinced they'd gotten away with it. They wait for someone like Sarah Hale, someone stubborn enough to keep asking questions long after everyone else has moved on. And sometimes, if you wait long enough, the truth comes clawing its way back to the surface. In March of 2018, on a cold morning when frost still clung to the grass and the Bitterroot Mountains gleamed white against a pale blue sky, a young couple named Daniel and Claire Matthews stood in the driveway of the old Thompson farmhouse and made an offer. They'd bought it at auction for $40,000, a fraction of its worth, but no one else had bid. They didn't believe in ghosts. They believed in sweat equity, renovation loans, and the satisfaction of restoring something broken. "We'll start with the upstairs," Daniel said, surveying the sagging porch. "Then the kitchen. The cellar can wait." But contractors have their own priorities, their own sense of what needs addressing first. And when they brought in the jackhammer that April afternoon to assess the foundation, to see if the cellar floor could support the weight of the renovations planned above, they discovered something that no amount of concrete or time or silence could keep buried forever. The truth. Wrapped in canvas. Wrapped in bone. Wrapped in 45 years of lies. April 17, 2018. Tuesday morning. Unseasonably warm. Daniel Matthews stood in the driveway of the Thompson farmhouse, coffee in hand, watching the contractor's truck navigate the rutted lane. Behind him, Claire was inside measuring windows for new curtains, humming something cheerful that echoed through the empty rooms. They'd closed on the property 3 weeks earlier, $40,000 for 4 acres, a barn, and a house that most of Cedar Falls considered cursed. Daniel, a software engineer who'd grown tired of Portland's housing market, saw only potential. Claire, a graphic designer with a Pinterest board full of farmhouse renovations, saw a project she could pour herself into. The stories didn't bother them. Every old house had stories. Morning, called Rick Vasquez, climbing out of his truck. He'd brought 2 workers and equipment that looked serious, a concrete saw, a jackhammer, demolition tools. Ready to see what we're dealing with down there? Daniel nodded. Foundation first, right? Foundation first, Rick confirmed. If that cellar floor is compromised, everything else is just decoration. They descended the wooden stairs into the cool dimness below. Rick swept his flashlight across the space, same shelves, same old paint cans, same single bulb hanging from its wire that had been there since the 1970s. But it was the floor that interested him. He crouched down, running his hand over the concrete. See this? He gestured to the far corner near the furnace. This section's different. Newer pour, different aggregate. Could be a patch from a water leak, could be settlement. We need to break it up and assess the substrate before we can guarantee your upstairs renovations won't crack the foundation. How long will it take? Claire asked from the top of the stairs. Couple hours to expose it. Then we'll know what we're dealing with. The jackhammer roared to life at 9:47 a.m. Rick worked methodically, breaking the concrete into manageable chunks while his crew hauled them up the stairs and into a growing pile outside. Dust filled the cellar, hanging in the air like fog. The noise was tremendous, the sharp percussion of steel against stone echoing off the walls. By 10:30, they'd exposed about 4 square feet of what lay beneath. That's when Rick stopped. He switched off the jackhammer and knelt down, brushing away dust with his gloved hand. His crew moved closer, curious. That's weird, one of them said. Beneath the broken concrete, where there should have been gravel or packed earth, was something else. Something that didn't belong. A layer of fabric, rotted, stained dark brown, but unmistakably fabric. Canvas, maybe. Heavy-duty material. Rick pulled at it gently. It came apart in his hands, crumbling like paper. Underneath was something pale. Something curved. Something that made Rick Vasquez, a contractor with 20 years of experience and a strong stomach, stand up very quickly and back away. Daniel, he called up the stairs, his voice tight. You need to call the police. Right now. By 11:15, Cedar Falls Sheriff's Department had cordoned off the property. By 11:45, the state police forensic team was en route from Lewiston. By 1:30 p.m., Detective Sarah Hale was driving south on Highway 95, her hands tight on the wheel, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd been in a meeting when the call came through, a supervisor's voice, carefully neutral. Sarah, that Thompson case you've been tracking. We've got something. You're going to want to see this in person. She'd made the 3-hour drive in 2.5. Now she stood in the driveway of the farmhouse she'd kept a photograph of for 30 years, watching as forensic techs in white coveralls descended into the cellar carrying equipment, lights, and evidence markers. Daniel and Claire Matthews sat on the porch steps, pale and shaken. A young deputy stood with them, taking their statement. News vans were already gathering at the end of the lane, held back by crime scene tape and a deputy who looked barely old enough to drive. Sarah approached the cellar. Stairs. Detective. E. Hale? The lead forensic tech, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, met her at the bottom. We've got 2 sets of remains. Adult. Wrapped in canvas that's mostly degraded. Burial appears to have been done quickly, bodies positioned side by side but not with any particular care. Sarah's throat felt tight. How long? Preliminary assessment? Decades. The concrete pour above them is consistent with 1970s construction materials. We'll need full analysis, but based on the degree of decomposition and the burial method. Dr. Chen paused. "This could be your missing couple." Sarah moved closer. Portable lights had been set up, illuminating the broken section of floor. Forensic markers, yellow numbered placards, dotted the scene. She could see them now, two shapes wrapped in decayed fabric, the canvas pulled back in places to reveal bone. Skulls. Ribs. The delicate architecture of human hands. They'd been lying here for 45 years. Right here. Beneath the feet of everyone who'd ever walked through this house searching for answers. "There's more," Dr. Chen said quietly. She led Sarah to the edge of the excavation and pointed to a marker labeled 7. "We found this near the bodies." A revolver. Rusted but intact, partially buried in the soil beneath the concrete. A Colt .38, if Sarah's guess was right. Old model, the kind that would have been common in the 1970s. "Still loaded?" Sarah asked. 2 rounds fired. 4 remaining. "We'll process it for prints and DNA, but given the preservation." Dr. Chen met Sarah's eyes. "We might get lucky." The excavation continued through the afternoon. Every bone, every scrap of fabric, every grain of soil was documented, photographed, and carefully removed. The bodies were transported to the State Forensic Lab in Boise in sealed containers. The gun went separately, handled with the kind of reverence reserved for evidence that might finally solve a case that had haunted a community for half a century. DNA analysis would take weeks. But Sarah already knew. She'd studied the case files until she could recite them from memory. She knew James Thompson's height, his build, the old ankle fracture that would show up on skeletal remains. She knew Rebecca had broken her wrist as a child, a riding accident her sister had mentioned in that long-ago interview. The bones would confirm it. But Sarah didn't need confirmation. Standing in that cellar, staring at the empty space where 2 people had been hidden for longer than some of Cedar Falls' current residents had been alive, she felt a strange mixture of vindication and grief. Sheriff Garland had been right to notice that newer concrete. He'd been right to feel something was wrong. He just hadn't been able to prove it. Now, 45 years later, the proof lay in carefully labeled evidence bags, being transported to labs where specialists would coax secrets from bone and metal and degraded fabric. By evening, the story had exploded across every news outlet in the region. Breaking: human remains found in Idaho cold case home. Couple missing since 1973 discovered buried beneath own farmhouse. Thompson disappearance, bodies found after 45 years. Reporters crowded the lane, their cameras capturing the cellar, the farmhouse, the yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the spring breeze. Daniel and Claire Matthews gave a brief statement, shocked, horrified, but grateful the truth was finally coming to light. They'd be staying with Claire's parents until the investigation concluded. Helen Crow, now 90 years old and living in an assisted care facility in Lewiston, watched the coverage on the evening news. A reporter had tracked her down, asked for comment. She'd simply shaken her head and said, "I always knew they never left. I always knew." In Eugene, Oregon, a 67-year-old mechanical engineer named Michael Thompson saw his parents' name scroll across the bottom of his television screen and felt the world tilt beneath his feet. In Boise, a 71-year-old librarian named Elaine Dennison received a phone call from a detective asking if she'd be available for an interview regarding new developments in her parents' case. Her hand shook as she set down the phone. The concrete had held for 45 years. The silence had held even longer. But secrets, Sarah Hale knew, had a weight of their own. And eventually, that weight became too much to bear. She stood in the Thompson cellar as the sun set and the portable lights cast harsh shadows across the empty excavation. The house above her was quiet now, no footsteps, no whispers, no radios turning on by themselves. For the first time in 45 years, the Thompson farmhouse was no longer silent. It was speaking. And Sarah Hale intended to listen to every word it had to say. The call came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the excavation. Detective Sarah Hale was at her desk in Coeur d'Alene, working through a different case entirely, when her phone lit up with a Boise number she recognized immediately. "Sarah, it's Pat Chen. You're going to want to sit down for this." Sarah was already sitting, but she understood the sentiment. "What did you find?" "Everything," Dr. Chen said. "We found everything." The forensic report ran to 47 pages, but the critical findings could be summarized in a few devastating paragraphs. The remains were conclusively identified as James Thompson, age 51, and Rebecca Thompson, age 49, through dental records and DNA comparison with their surviving children. Cause of death: gunshot wounds. James had been shot once in the chest, the bullet penetrating the fourth rib and traveling through the heart. Rebecca had been shot in the back of the head, execution style, the bullet entering at the base of the skull and exiting through the frontal bone. Both deaths would have been rapid. Likely instantaneous. But it was the gun that changed everything. The Colt .38 Special recovered from the burial site had spent 45 years in soil and darkness, but the relatively dry cellar environment had preserved it better than anyone expected. Rust had seized the cylinder and pitted the barrel, but the grip, textured rubber over metal, had protected what lay beneath. Fingerprints. Not just one set. 2 distinct sets, surprisingly intact, lifted using modern techniques that hadn't existed in 1973. The first set belonged to Michael Thompson, age 67, currently residing in Eugene, Oregon. The second set belonged to Elaine Dennison, née Thompson, age 71, currently residing in Boise, Idaho. Their own children. Sarah sat in the Idaho State Police briefing room on Friday afternoon, surrounded by her supervisor, the prosecuting attorney, and 3 other detectives, and watched as the evidence was laid out like pieces of a puzzle that had finally, horrifyingly, come together. Both siblings handled the weapon, Dr. Chen explained, her voice clinical but her expression grim. She stood beside a projection screen showing enlarged photographs of the fingerprint analysis. Michael's prints are on the grip and trigger. Elaine's are on the barrel and cylinder. The positioning suggests Michael fired the weapon, and Elaine handled it afterward, possibly during cleanup or burial. "Jesus Christ," muttered one of the detectives. "Ballistics confirms the bullets extracted from the remains were fired from this gun," Dr. Chen continued. "The rifling patterns are conclusive. This is your murder weapon. And both children touched it." The prosecuting attorney, a sharp woman named Victoria Reeves, leaned forward. "Do we have timeline confirmation?" Dr. Chen nodded. "The pathology is consistent with death occurring in early October 1973, exact date impossible to determine, but the burial appears to have happened within 24 to 48 hours of death. The concrete pour above them used materials and techniques common to that period. Someone knew what they were doing, not expertly, but competently enough to hide 2 bodies for 45 years. Sarah spoke for the first time. James Thompson worked at the pulp mill. Machinery foreman. He would have known concrete, construction techniques, how to repair a cellar floor. Or how to bury bodies beneath one, Reeves said quietly. The room fell silent. The psychological shock rippled through Cedar Falls like an aftershock. Their own children. The phrase was repeated in hushed conversations at Hanson's General Store, in the pews of First Baptist Church, in the break room at the new community center that had replaced the old mill offices. People who'd known the Thompsons, who'd gone to school with Linda or Michael, who'd been taught by Rebecca, who'd worked alongside James, struggled to reconcile the ordinary family they remembered with the horror that had been hidden beneath their farmhouse. "I knew Michael when he was in high school," said Tom Birch, now 75 and retired from the feed store. Quiet kid. Kept to himself. But murder? His own parents? He shook his head, staring into his coffee. "You think you know people." Others remembered differently. Vague memories surfaced of tension, of arguments overheard, of Michael's sudden departure to Oregon just months before the disappearance. Hindsight, Sarah knew, had a way of reshaping the past. She interviewed Dr. Raymond Foster, the forensic pathologist who'd conducted the skeletal analysis, in his office at the Boise Medical Examiner's facility. He was in his 60s, methodical and precise, with the detached professionalism of someone who'd spent decades studying death. The positioning of the body suggests they were killed elsewhere and moved, Dr. Foster explained, pulling up photographs on his computer. Probably in the house itself, the living room or kitchen, given the lack of blood evidence in other locations. They were wrapped hastily in canvas, probably drop cloths or tarps, and carried to the cellar. How long would that take? Sarah asked. To kill them, wrap them, and bury them beneath fresh concrete? With 2 people working together? Dr. Foster considered. 12 to 18 hours, minimum. They'd need to dig out the old floor section, position the bodies, mix and pour concrete, let it cure enough to walk on. This wasn't a panic burial. This required planning. But not much planning. No. Dr. Foster met her eyes. They didn't plan it well. They just needed to hide it. If they'd been truly calculating, they would have disposed of the bodies elsewhere, the woods, the river, somewhere far from the house. Instead, they buried them in the one place guaranteed to eventually be discovered if the house was ever renovated. Why take that risk? Time pressure, most likely. They needed the bodies hidden immediately, and they couldn't risk transporting them. Maybe it was dark. Maybe they couldn't get the truck started without being seen. Maybe they simply panicked. He paused. Murder does that to people, even to those who think they're prepared. Sarah returned to her office and spread the original case files across her desk. She'd read them dozens of times over the years, but now she was looking for something specific. She found it in Helen Crow's initial statement, given to Sheriff Garland on October 6, 1973. James mentioned to me last month, maybe 3 weeks ago, that he needed to repair a section of the cellar floor. Said there was cracking from water seepage near the furnace. I remember because he asked if I knew anyone who sold bags of concrete mix cheap. 3 weeks before he died, James Thompson had been planning cellar repairs. 3 weeks before he died, someone had known that fresh concrete in that cellar wouldn't look suspicious. Sarah pulled out a legal pad and began constructing a timeline. September 15, 1973, approximate. James mentions cellar repairs to Helen Crow. Possibly mentions it to his children as well. October 5, 1973, evening, James and Rebecca are killed in their home. 2 shots fired from a .38 revolver. Both children's fingerprints on the weapon. October 5 to 6, 1973, overnight, bodies wrapped in canvas and moved to cellar. Section of floor excavated, bodies positioned, concrete mixed and poured. October 6, 1973, morning, house appears untouched except for missing occupants. Helen Crow notices something wrong. October 6, 1973, late morning, Sheriff's Department enters house. Sees fresh concrete in cellar but lacks probable cause to investigate further. The pieces fit. Almost too perfectly. Sarah sat back in her chair, staring at the timeline. 2 adult children. 1 gun. 2 bodies buried beneath concrete that would have looked entirely normal if James himself had just finished repairs. Premeditation or opportunity? Murder or manslaughter escalated? She wouldn't know until she talked to them. Sarah picked up her phone and dialed the first number. Michael Thompson in Eugene. It rang 4 times before a man's voice answered, cautious and already weary. Mr. Thompson, this is Detective Sarah Hale with the Idaho State Police. I need you to come in for an interview regarding new evidence in your parents' case. Silence on the other end. Then, quietly, I wondered when you'd call. The second call went to Elaine Dennison in Boise. Her voice was steadier, more controlled. Mrs. Dennison, we have forensic evidence that places you at the scene of your parents' deaths. I'm going to need you to come in voluntarily, or I can arrange for officers to bring you in." Another pause. Then, with that same preternatural calm that neighbors had always remarked on, "I'll come in tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. Mrs. Dennison. I've been expecting this call for 45 years, Detective. One more night won't matter." She hung up. Sarah sat alone in her office as evening darkened the windows, surrounded by photographs of a farmhouse, skeletal remains, and a rusted gun that had waited nearly half a century to tell its story. Dr. Foster's words echoed in her mind. They didn't plan it well. They just needed to hide it. And they had. For 45 years, they'd hidden it. But the dead, Sarah had learned, don't stay hidden forever. Eventually, they speak. And when they do, the truth, no matter how long buried, comes clawing its way back to the surface. Michael Thompson lived in a modest ranch-style house on a quiet cul-de-sac in Eugene, Oregon, where the lawns were well-maintained and neighbors waved but rarely lingered to chat. When Detective Sarah Hale and 2 Oregon State Police officers arrived at 7:30 a.m. on a gray Friday morning, they found him already awake, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He answered the door in slippers and a cardigan, looking every bit the retired engineer, thinning gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of unremarkable face that disappeared in crowds. His neighbors, when interviewed later, would describe him the same way they always had, polite but distant, kept to himself, never caused problems. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said. "We spoke yesterday. I know who you are." His voice was quiet, resigned. "Should I call a lawyer?" "That's your right. But I'd like you to come with us voluntarily to answer some questions." Michael looked past her to the patrol cars in his driveway, to the neighbors already peering through curtains. After 45 years of silence, the past had finally found him. "Let me get my shoes," he said. 300 miles south, in a comfortable suburban neighborhood in Boise, Elaine Dennison was already dressed and waiting when the doorbell rang at 9 a.m. sharp. Her husband Robert stood in the kitchen doorway, his face pale and confused. "Elaine, what's happening? What do they want?" She touched his arm gently, the same calming gesture she'd used for 42 years of marriage. "It's about my parents. I need to go with them. Call David Morris, he's a good attorney. Tell him I'll need representation." "Your parents?" "But that was. I know how long ago it was." She picked up her purse, checked that she had her phone. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. Everything about Elaine Dennison was steady, had always been steady, even now, as 2 detectives stood on her porch with questions that could destroy the carefully constructed life she'd built. The librarian who'd read stories to countless children, who'd recommended books with patience and warmth, who'd organized summer reading programs and winter coat drives, that woman walked calmly to the unmarked police car and got into the back seat without protest. Her neighbors would later describe her as they always had: intelligent, disciplined, emotionally reserved but never unkind. Someone who seemed to carry herself with a kind of careful control, as though any deviation might cause something inside her to shatter. Now, perhaps, it finally would. The interviews were conducted separately, 200 miles apart, but Sarah had coordinated them to happen simultaneously. She took Michael herself, in a sparse interrogation room at the Eugene Police Department, while her colleague Detective James Ortiz handled Elaine in Boise. Sarah sat across from Michael Thompson and saw a man who'd been waiting for this moment most of his adult life. "You know why you're here," she said. "Yes. We found your parents." "I know. We also found the gun." She slid a photograph across the table, the rusted Colt .38, tagged and catalogued. "Your fingerprints are on it, Michael. On the grip. On the trigger." He stared at the photograph. His hands, folded on the table, began to tremble. "I didn't," he stopped. "Start it again." It wasn't supposed to. Wasn't supposed to what? Silence. Sarah leaned forward. 2 people were shot with that gun. Your mother. Your father. Both killed in their own home on October 5, 1973, and buried beneath their cellar floor. Your fingerprints are on the murder weapon. Your sister's fingerprints are on it too. So I need you to tell me what happened that night. I want a lawyer. That's your right. But Michael, she waited until he looked up, met her eyes. This secret has been eating at you for 45 years. I can see it. You've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Now's your chance to finally tell the truth. His face crumpled. For a moment, he looked like a 22-year-old boy again, terrified and overwhelmed. I didn't mean to. He whispered. It was an accident. It was supposed to be just talking. Just fixing things. In Boise, Detective Ortiz was having a very different conversation. Elaine Dennison sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, expression neutral. She declined coffee, declined water, declined the offer to wait for her attorney. Mrs. Dennison, we have forensic evidence placing you at the scene of your parents' deaths. What kind of evidence? Your fingerprints on the weapon used to kill them. Something flickered in her eyes, not surprise, but calculation. The look of someone rapidly assessing options. I'd like to speak with my attorney. Of course. But before he arrives, I want you to understand something. Ortiz slid a photograph across the table, the excavation site, the wrapped bodies, the awful intimacy of death revealed. Your parents were buried in their own home. Beneath concrete. For 45 years. Your brother's prints are on that gun too. So one of you pulled the trigger, and one of you helped hide it. The question is which one of you is going to tell the truth first. Elaine stared at the photograph for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost clinical. If I tell you what happened, what happens to my family? My husband, my daughters, they don't know anything about this. That depends on what you tell me. Another long silence. Then, I want immunity. Full immunity in exchange for testimony. I can't promise that. But I can tell the prosecutor you cooperated. Elaine looked up, and for the first time, Detective Ortiz saw something crack in that carefully maintained composure. Her eyes were wet. I never pulled the trigger, she said quietly. But I buried them. I helped pour the concrete. I lied to the sheriff. I've lied every day for 45 years. Her voice broke. I never pulled the trigger, but I buried them. Back in Eugene, Michael Thompson was crying openly now, his words tumbling out between gasping breaths. He wouldn't stop. My father, he wouldn't stop saying those things. About me being worthless, about wasting my life, about being a disappointment. And I snapped. The gun was in the drawer. His gun. I just wanted him to stop talking. I just wanted. You shot your father. Yes. Barely a whisper. And then my mother started screaming. And I, God help me, I couldn't let her tell anyone. I couldn't. He put his face in his hands. Sarah sat back, her heart hammering. 45 years of silence, broken in a matter of hours. What happened after? She asked quietly. I called Elaine. She was the only person I could call. She drove down from Boise that night. She helped me. Wrap them, move them to the cellar. We worked all night. She knew Dad had been planning to repair the floor. She said we could make it look like he'd finished the job. Michael looked up, his face ravaged. She said no one would ever look. And for 45 years, no one did. By Saturday morning, arrest warrants had been issued in both states. Michael Thompson was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Elaine Dennison was charged with 2 counts of accessory after the fact, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. The media storm was immediate and overwhelming. Breaking: brother and sister arrested in 1973 Idaho cold case. Thompson children charged in parents' deaths, bodies hidden 45 years. I buried them, sister's confession shocks community. News helicopters circled the Boise courthouse. Cameras captured Michael Thompson being led from the Eugene jail, his hands cuffed, his face hidden. Elaine Dennison walked into the Ada County Jail with her head high and her expression blank, looking like someone attending a particularly unpleasant business meeting. In Cedar Falls, the shock was visceral. The town gathered, not officially, but organically, at the Oak Street Care Center where Helen Crow now lived. Someone had brought her a television. Someone else had brought coffee and pastries. By mid-morning, 15 people crowded into her small room, watching the coverage in stunned silence. Helen sat in her wheelchair by the window, looking out toward the mountains, toward the valley where she'd spent 90 years of her life. I always knew they never left, she said to no one in particular. I saw those lights that night. I heard the radio. I knew something was wrong. A younger woman, Helen's great-niece, touched her shoulder gently. You tried to tell them. I did. Helen's voice was soft, distant. But who listens to an old woman looking out windows? On the television, a reporter stood outside the Thompson farmhouse, now surrounded by news vans and curious onlookers, describing the case that had haunted Cedar Falls for nearly half a century. For 45 years, this community has wondered what happened to James and Rebecca Thompson. Today, they have their answer. And it's more horrifying than anyone imagined. Helen Crow watched the screen, watched the house she'd stared at for decades, and felt something she hadn't felt since October 6, 1973. Relief. The truth had finally come home. The full confession came 3 days after the arrests, in a windowless room at the Ada County Jail where Michael Thompson sat across from Detective Sarah Hale and 2 prosecutors, his attorney beside him looking grim. Michael had aged a decade in 72 hours. His eyes were hollow, his hands never stopped shaking, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 45 years of silence finally breaking apart. I need to tell you what really happened, he said. All of it. Sarah pressed record on the video camera. Go ahead, Michael. He took a breath that sounded like drowning. It was never about the inheritance. That's what everyone will think, but it wasn't. It was about, he stopped, searched for words. It was about never being enough. Never being what he wanted. Never being the son he could be proud of. Michael's hands twisted together on the table. I dropped out of community college that spring. I was working construction in Portland, barely making rent, and I knew Dad was disappointed. He'd wanted me to be an engineer like him. Disciplined. Successful. Instead, I was, his voice cracked. I was a failure. And he never let me forget it. Why did you come back to Cedar Falls that night? Sarah asked. He called me. Told me to come home. Said we needed to talk about my future, about making something of myself. I drove down on Friday afternoon, got there around 6. Mom had made dinner, stew, bread, the usual. Everything looked normal. But I could feel it, you know. That tension. The way Dad looked at me like I was something broken he couldn't fix. Michael closed his eyes. We ate dinner. Barely spoke. Then Mom started cleaning up, and Dad told me to follow him to the living room. That's when it started. The argument? He started listing everything I'd done wrong. Dropping out. Moving away. Not having a plan. Not being responsible. He said I was wasting my potential, that I was lazy, that I'd never amount to anything because I didn't have discipline. Michael's voice hardened. He said I was a disappointment. That he'd raised me better than this. That sometimes he wondered if I was even really his son. Sarah saw it then, the wound that had never healed, the words that had festered for decades. I tried to defend myself. I said I was figuring things out, that I just needed time. But he wouldn't listen. He never listened. He just kept going, about how embarrassed he was, how he couldn't talk about me at work, how Rebecca's sister had asked about me and he'd had nothing good to say. Where was your mother during this? In the kitchen. I could hear dishes clanking, water running. She knew what was happening. She always knew when he got like this. But she never, he stopped. She never stood up to him. Not for me. Not for anyone. Michael's breathing had become ragged. And then he said the thing that broke something in me. He said, maybe if you'd been more like your sister, you'd actually be worth something. Silence filled the interrogation room. Elaine was always the good one, Michael continued, his voice distant. Smart, composed, married well, did everything right. And I was the mistake. The disappointment. And in that moment, I couldn't hear it anymore. I couldn't stand there and let him tear me apart one more time. What did you do? I saw the gun. Michael's eyes opened, unfocused. Dad kept a revolver in the drawer of the side table. For protection, he said, though we never needed it. And I grabbed it. I didn't think. I just needed him to stop talking. I pointed it at him and I said, shut up. Just shut up. Sarah leaned forward slightly. And then? He laughed. Michael's voice was barely audible. He actually laughed. Said I didn't have the spine to do anything. That I was too weak, too pathetic. He started walking toward me, reaching for the gun. And his face crumpled. I pulled the trigger. The words hung in the air like smoke. The sound was so loud. Louder than I expected. And Dad he stopped. Looked down at his chest. Blood was spreading across his shirt. He looked at me like he couldn't believe it. Like even dying, he couldn't believe I was capable of it. He fell. He fell. And Mom started screaming. She came running from the kitchen and she saw him on the floor and she saw me holding the gun and she kept screaming. I told her to stop. I begged her to stop. But she wouldn't. She was backing away from me, toward the phone, and I knew if she called someone, my life was over. Sarah's stomach turned. So you shot your mother? I didn't want to. Tears streamed down Michael's face. I loved my mother. But she was going to call the police. She was going to tell everyone. And God forgive me, I shot her. In the back of the head. She dropped like someone had cut her strings. The room was utterly silent except for Michael's ragged breathing. What happened next? Sarah asked quietly. I stood there. I don't know for how long. Just stood there with the gun in my hand and my parents dead on the floor and the radio still playing in the kitchen. Gospel songs. Like nothing had happened. He wiped his eyes with shaking hands. Then I panicked. I dragged them to the cellar, one at a time, wrapped in drop cloths from Dad's workshop. It took hours. They were so heavy. And all I could think was that I had to hide them. I had to make it look like they'd left. Or disappeared. Anything but this. The concrete, Sarah prompted. Dad had been planning to repair that section of floor for weeks. He'd already bought the materials, bags of concrete mix in the barn, tools, everything. I thought, if I buried them there and poured fresh concrete, it would just look like Dad had finished the job. No one would question it. But you couldn't do it alone. Michael shook his head. I tried. I got them into the cellar, dug out the old section of floor. But I was exhausted. Terrified. I didn't know how to mix the concrete properly. And I needed someone who could think clearly. Someone who could help me figure out what to do. So you called Elaine. At 2 in the morning. Woke her up. Told her there'd been an accident and I needed her help. She asked what kind of accident and I couldn't say it over the phone. I just said, please come. Please don't ask questions. Just come. Sarah had read Elaine's statement. She knew what came next. She drove down from Boise. Got there around 4:30 in the morning. I met her at the door. She took one look at my face and said, "What did you do, Michael?" His voice dropped to a whisper. I showed her. Took her down to the cellar. And she stood there staring at them. At Mom and Dad wrapped in canvas on the dirt floor. She didn't scream. Didn't cry. Just stood there. And then she said, "We have to finish this. We have to finish it now before anyone sees." She agreed to help you. She said we didn't have a choice. That if I went to prison, it would destroy the whole family. That Linda couldn't handle it. That Mom and Dad were already gone and nothing could change that. She said the only thing we could do was make sure no one ever found out. Michael's attorney shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. We worked until dawn. Elaine read the instructions on the concrete bags. We mixed it, poured it, smoothed it. She was so calm. So precise. Like she was following a recipe. By the time the sun came up, you couldn't tell anything had happened down there. And then? We cleaned the house. Washed the blood from the living room floor. There wasn't much, but enough. Put Dad's gun back in the drawer. Made sure everything looked normal. Elaine said we needed to make it look like they'd just stepped out. Like they'd be back any minute. Sarah watched him carefully. When did you leave? Around 8. Elaine left first, back to Boise. I waited another hour, made sure everything was perfect. Then I drove back to Portland. And I waited for someone to notice they were gone. Helen Crone noticed that same morning. I know. I heard about it days later when Linda called me. She was crying, asking if I knew where Mom and Dad were. I told her I didn't know. I told her I hadn't seen them in months. His voice broke. I lied to my own sister while she fell apart. Sarah pulled out the transcript of Elaine's statement and slid it across the table. Your sister said something interesting in her confession. She said, "We thought the world would forget." Is that what you thought, Michael? That if enough time passed, no one would care anymore? Michael stared at the transcript. We thought, he stopped, started again. We thought after a few months, it would just be another cold case. Another unsolved mystery. We thought people would speculate for a while and then move on. We thought, his voice cracked completely. We thought we could live with it. We thought the guilt would fade. Did it? No. The word came out like a sob. Not for a single day in 45 years. Every time I saw a police car. Every time someone mentioned my parents. Every anniversary, every birthday they should have had. It was always there. Always. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes pleading for something, understanding, forgiveness, absolution she couldn't give. I killed my parents over words. Over disappointment and anger and 22 years of never being good enough. And then I buried them like trash and pretended they'd vanished. What kind of person does that? Sarah had no answer for him. Later, sitting alone in her office long after midnight, Sarah stared at the case file that had haunted her for 30 years. The house on Willow Creek Lane had kept its secret perfectly. For 45 years, it had held 2 bodies and 2 lives' worth of lies beneath its foundation. Michael and Elaine had thought the world would forget. But Sarah had learned something in her years chasing cold cases. Secrets don't die. They don't fade. They don't forgive. They wait. They wait in cellar floors and locked drawers and midnight conversations that no one else hears. They wait until someone asks the right questions. Until someone refuses to look away. Until the earth itself gives up its dead. And then, finally, they speak. The trial of Michael Thompson began on a cold January morning in 2019, 9 months after the bodies were discovered. The Ada County Courthouse in Boise had seen its share of sensational cases, but nothing quite like this. A 67-year-old retired engineer accused of murdering his parents 45 years earlier and hiding their bodies beneath their own home. The courtroom was packed from the first day, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. News cameras lined the courthouse steps. Reporters from as far as New York and Los Angeles filed daily updates. Inside, Michael Thompson sat at the defense table looking smaller than his 6-foot frame, dressed in an ill-fitting suit, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His attorney, a veteran public defender named Alan Cartwright, had argued for a change of venue, too much publicity, too much emotion, but the motion had been denied. The prosecution, led by Victoria Reeves, laid out the case with methodical precision: the fingerprints on the murder weapon, the ballistics evidence, the forensic timeline, and most damningly, Michael's own confession captured on video and played for the jury in its entirety. Watching Michael describe shooting his father, then his mother, then burying them while gospel music played on the kitchen radio, the jury sat transfixed, several wiping tears, one woman covering her mouth in horror. The defense didn't dispute the facts. How could they? Instead, Cartwright built a case around context, around the psychological damage of a lifetime spent under James Thompson's criticism, around a moment of tragic impulse that spiraled into decades of guilt and remorse. This is not a case of a cold-blooded killer, Cartwright argued during opening statements. This is a case of a young man who broke under years of emotional abuse, who made a terrible decision in a moment of rage, and who has paid for it every single day since. The psychiatric evaluations, admitted into evidence, painted a portrait of profound family dysfunction. Dr. Ellen Vasquez, a forensic psychologist who'd evaluated Michael over 6 weeks, testified that he exhibited signs of complex PTSD, chronic depression, and what she termed prolonged duress stress disorder, the psychological impact of carrying a devastating secret for half a lifetime. Michael Thompson has been essentially serving a psychological life sentence since 1973, Dr. Vasquez explained to the jury. The guilt, the fear of discovery, the inability to form meaningful relationships because of what he was hiding, these aren't characteristics of a remorseless killer. These are characteristics of someone being destroyed by their own conscience. The prosecution countered with their own expert, Dr. Raymond Chen, who testified that regardless of Michael's emotional state, he'd had ample opportunity to confess, to turn himself in, to seek help, and had chosen concealment instead. Guilt is not the same as remorse, Dr. Chen stated. True remorse leads to accountability. Mr. Thompson chose self-preservation. The public reaction was deeply divided. In Cedar Falls, opinion split along generational lines. Older residents who'd known James Thompson remembered him as demanding, sometimes harsh, but ultimately a product of his era, a man who believed in discipline and hard work. They saw Michael as a murderer who'd killed his parents and destroyed a family. James Thompson worked hard his whole life, said Tom Birch in an interview with the Lewiston Morning Tribune. He didn't deserve to be shot by his own son and buried like an animal. I don't care what kind of childhood Michael had. You don't kill your parents. Younger residents, particularly those who'd experienced their own struggles with family expectations and mental health, saw shades of tragedy in the case. Online forums and social media debates raged about toxic masculinity, generational trauma, and the long-term effects of emotional abuse. I'm not saying what Michael did was right, wrote one commenter on a regional news site. But I understand how someone can break. I understand what it's like to never be good enough for a parent who won't see you. The editorials in regional newspapers reflected the same divide. Lewiston Morning Tribune, Justice 45 years late, Thompson case shows murder will not be hidden forever. Boise Weekly, the tragedy of the Thompson family, when abuse becomes murder. Idaho Statesman, cold case resolution brings questions, not closure. Church gatherings in Cedar Falls became forums for collective grief and confusion. Pastor David Williams of First Baptist, where Rebecca had attended services, where she'd hosted her Sunday teas, struggled to address a congregation torn between compassion and condemnation. "We are called to both justice and mercy," he said during a sermon 3 weeks into the trial. "We mourn James and Rebecca Thompson. We pray for their souls. But we also recognize that families can be broken in ways that lead to unspeakable tragedy. Our faith asks us to hold both truths." Not everyone agreed. Several longtime members left the church, offended by what they saw as sympathy for a murderer. Elaine Dennison's trial, held separately in March, was shorter and less dramatic. Facing charges of accessory after the fact, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice, Elaine had accepted a plea deal, 15 years, with possibility of parole after 10. Her cooperation with prosecutors, providing detailed testimony about the burial, the cover-up, the decades of lies, had earned her leniency. She testified at Michael's trial, her voice steady and clinical, describing how she'd arrived at the farmhouse in the pre-dawn darkness and found her brother in shock, their parents dead in the cellar. "I made a choice that night," she said from the witness stand, meeting the jury's eyes. "I chose to protect my brother instead of telling the truth. I've lived with that choice every day since. It was wrong. But in that moment, with my parents already dead and my brother falling apart, I thought it was the only choice I had." The prosecutor pressed her, "Did you ever consider coming forward? In 45 years, did you ever think about telling someone?" Elaine was quiet for a long moment. "Every single day," she finally said. "But every day, I chose silence. I chose my daughters not knowing their mother was complicit in murder. I chose my husband not knowing who he'd really married. I chose a normal life built on a foundation of lies." Her voice cracked slightly. "And I will spend whatever years I have left knowing that those choices buried my parents a second time, buried them in silence." The testimony was devastating. Several jurors wept. Public opinion on Elaine was less divided but no less passionate. Many saw her as a victim herself, a woman forced to choose between family loyalty and justice in an impossible situation. Others saw calculated self-preservation, a woman who'd lived a comfortable life while her parents rotted beneath concrete. Her sentencing hearing in April was brief. The judge, a stern woman named Catherine Moore, showed little sympathy. "You had 45 years to do the right thing, Mrs. Dennison. 45 years to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Your cooperation now, while appreciated, does not erase decades of deliberate deception." 15 years. Elaine was 71. If she served the full sentence, she'd be 86 when released. Michael Thompson's verdict came on a gray afternoon in late March. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. When they returned, the forewoman, a middle-aged teacher from Meridian, looked exhausted. "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of James Thompson, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Rebecca Thompson, how do you find?" "Guilty." Michael showed no reaction. He simply sat, staring at his hands. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later was packed with spectators. Linda Thompson Marshall's children attended, the grandchildren James and Rebecca had never met, representing a family fractured beyond repair. Detective Sarah Hale sat in Th. E. back row, bearing witness to the case that had consumed 3 decades of her career. Judge Thomas Brennan reviewed the psychiatric evaluations, the letters from Michael's few friends attesting to his remorse, the prosecution's argument that 2 lives had been stolen and justice demanded accountability. "Mr. Thompson," he said finally, "you have expressed remorse. Your psychological evaluation suggests genuine trauma. But you made choices, repeated, deliberate choices over 45 years, to hide what you'd done rather than face the consequences. You denied James and Rebecca Thompson proper burial. You denied their family closure. You denied justice for nearly half a century. The sentence, life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 40 years. Michael Thompson would be 107 years old before he could be considered for release. Helen Crow died 3 weeks after the verdict, in her sleep, at the Oak Street Care Center. She was 90 years old. Her great-niece found her in the morning, her television still on, tuned to the news channel that had covered the trial. At her small funeral, attended by 24 people who remembered the sharp-eyed nurse who'd noticed what no one else had, Pastor Williams said, Helen Crow spent 45 years knowing something was wrong. She saw the lights that night. She felt the wrongness of that house. She called for help when no one else did. She never got to hear James and Rebecca Thompson say thank you, but I believe, somehow, they know. Her obituary in the Lewiston Morning Tribune mentioned her nursing career, her late husband Walter, her dedication to her community. The final line read, Mrs. Crow is remembered as the neighbor who never stopped watching, who never stopped caring, and who finally saw justice served. In Cedar Falls, a small memorial service was held for James and Rebecca Thompson, 47 years after their deaths. Fewer than 30 people attended. Most of those who'd known them were dead themselves, or too old to make the journey. The farmhouse on Willow Creek Lane stood empty in the background, a for sale sign planted in the overgrown yard. No one had bid on it at auction. No one wanted the house where a family had destroyed itself. Pastor Williams read from Psalms. A local woman sang, Amazing Grace. And then, quietly, the small crowd dispersed, leaving 2 simple headstones in the Cedar Falls Cemetery, stones that should have been placed 45 years earlier. James Arthur Thompson. 1922 to 1973. Beloved father. Rebecca Lynn Thompson. 1924 to 1973. Beloved mother. The town that had wondered and whispered and speculated for nearly half a century finally had its answers. But Cedar Falls would never fully heal. Some wounds, cut deep enough, never do. September 2019. Nearly 50 years after James and Rebecca Thompson disappeared from their farmhouse on Willow Creek Lane. The memorial service was held on a Sunday afternoon when the autumn light fell golden across the Bitterroot Valley, painting the mountains in the same amber and rust tones that had colored that long-ago October evening in 1973. The air smelled of pine and approaching cold, of wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys, of seasons turning and time passing in the way it only does in small mountain towns where memories run deep and long. 47 people gathered in the Cedar Falls Community Park, not the cemetery this time, but the living space where families brought their children, where summer concerts played, where life continued despite the weight of the past. A simple wooden platform had been erected, decorated with photographs of James and Rebecca from better times, their wedding day in 1948, Rebecca in her classroom surrounded by smiling third graders, James standing proudly beside a new truck, both of them young and hopeful and utterly unaware of how their story would end. Pastor David Williams stood at the microphone, older now, his hair gone white, but his voice still steady. We gather today, he began, not to reopen wounds, but to finally offer James and Rebecca Thompson what they were denied for so long, recognition. Remembrance. A chance to be mourned properly by the community they called home. The crowd was an unusual mixture. Elderly residents who'd known the Thompsons personally sat beside younger families who knew them only as the subjects of Idaho's most haunting cold case. Detective Sarah Hale stood near the back, her hands clasped, her expression thoughtful. Tom Birch was there, leaning on a cane, his eyes distant. Even a few reporters had come, though they kept a respectful distance. Linda Thompson Marshall's daughter, Jennifer, now 35, approached the microphone with trembling hands. She'd never met her grandparents, they'd been dead 6 months before she was born, but she'd grown up with the weight of their absence. "I used to wonder what they were like," she said, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "My mother didn't talk about them much. It hurt too much, I think. But I've read letters they wrote. I've seen photographs. I've heard stories from people who knew them. And what I've learned is that they were ordinary people who deserved an ordinary life. They deserved to grow old. They deserved to meet their grandchildren. They deserved better than what happened in that house." She paused, composing herself. "I don't know how to forgive what my uncle did. I don't know if forgiveness is even the right word. But I can stand here and say that James and Rebecca Thompson mattered. Their lives mattered. And they should be remembered as more than a tragedy. They should be remembered as people who lived and loved and contributed to this community for decades before one terrible night erased everything." The service lasted an hour. Hymns were sung, the same ones that had played on the radio that October night. Stories were shared by those who remembered Rebecca's kindness in the classroom, James' reliability at the mill, the quiet dignity they'd brought to Cedar Falls. And when it ended, people filed past the photographs, some leaving flowers, others simply touching the frames as though making a connection across half a century of silence. Daniel and Claire Matthews stood at the edge of the gathering, watching. They'd made a decision in the months since the trial, a decision that surprised many and confused others. They weren't selling the farmhouse. They weren't tearing it down. They were staying. "People think we're crazy," Claire said to Sarah Hale afterward, standing in the driveway of the property that had become infamous. "Maybe we are. But this land, it's beautiful. And what happened here, as horrible as it was, is part of its history. We can't erase that. But we can honor it." They'd had the cellar completely excavated and filled, creating a level foundation for a future garden. In the spot where the bodies had been buried, they'd planted a Japanese maple, a tree that would blaze brilliant red each fall, a living memorial to lives cut short. A small bronze plaque had been mounted on a stone near the tree. "In memory of James and Rebecca Thompson. 1922 to 1973 and 1924 to 1973. May truth bring peace. We're not trying to profit from tragedy," Daniel explained. "We're not turning this into some macabre tourist attraction. We're acknowledging what happened here, and then we're living our lives. Because that's what homes are supposed to be for. Living." Sarah Hale understood. She'd spent 30 years chasing the truth about this house, and now that the truth had been found, she felt an unexpected sense of completion, not satisfaction, exactly, because there was no satisfaction in a case like this. Just closure. The kind that comes from finally being able to close a file folder and know that every question has been answered. She stood alone in the cellar one last time before Daniel and Claire completed their renovations. The concrete had been jackhammered away entirely. The earth beneath had been excavated, examined, and certified clean by forensic teams. Now it was just a space, empty, echoing, waiting to be filled with something new. Sunlight filtered through the boards of the ceiling where Daniel had begun opening up the floor above, preparing to transform the dark cellar into a proper basement with windows and light. Sarah walked slowly across the dirt floor, her footsteps the only sound. For 45 years, this space had held the most devastating of secrets. 2 people murdered by their own son, buried in darkness, wrapped in silence. The house above had changed owners, had stood empty, had earned a reputation for whispers and cold drafts and radios that turned on by themselves. People had claimed it was haunted. But Sarah knew better. The house hadn't been haunted by ghosts. It had been haunted by truth, by the terrible weight of what had happened here, by the unfinished business of 2 lives stolen and hidden. The house had been trying to speak for 45 years. Through Helen Crow's unease. Through the discomfort of owners who couldn't quite explain why they felt wrong here. Through the strange preservation of that October evening, frozen in memory. And finally, When Daniel Matthews' contractor had brought a jackhammer to this floor, the house had been able to speak at last. Sarah climbed the wooden stairs for the final time and stepped out into the autumn afternoon. The mountains rose purple and gold in the distance. The creek that gave Willow Creek Lane its name burbled softly behind the property. The air smelled clean and sharp, carrying the promise of winter. Daniel was working on the porch, replacing rotted boards. Claire was planting bulbs near the foundation, daffodils and tulips that would bloom in spring, bringing color to a place that had known too much darkness. "You think they'll be happy here?" Sarah asked Claire. Claire looked up, dirt on her hands, a small smile on her face. "I think any house can be happy if the people in it choose light instead of darkness. What happened here was terrible. But it's over now. The truth came out. Justice was served. Now it's time to let this place heal." Sarah nodded. She understood that too. She drove back to Coeur d'Alene that evening, watching the landscape change from mountains to plains, from farmland to forest. The Thompson case file sat in a box in her office, marked closed in red letters. She'd eventually archive it, file it away with all the other cases she'd solved over a 30-year career. But she'd never forget it. She'd never forget standing in Helen Crow's small room at the care center, watching an old woman finally see justice served before she died. She'd never forget Michael Thompson's confession, the way his voice had broken as he described killing his mother. She'd never forget Elaine Dennison's clinical calm, the way she'd maintained perfect composure even as her life crumbled around her. Most of all, she'd never forget the farmhouse itself, the way it had stood on Willow Creek Lane for 45 years, keeping its terrible secret, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The case had taught her something she'd suspected for years but now knew with certainty. Secrets don't die. They don't fade into memory or dissolve with time. They sink into the foundations of houses, into the soil beneath concrete, into the spaces between what people say and what they know. They wait. They wait through decades of silence and lies and carefully constructed normal lives. They wait through ownership changes and renovation plans and children who grow up never knowing the truth. They wait through long winters and golden autumns and the slow, steady passage of years. They wait until someone refuses to look away. Until someone brings a jackhammer to a cellar floor that looks just slightly too new. Until the earth itself can no longer hold what's been buried. And then, finally, they speak. Back on Willow Creek Lane, as the sun set behind the Bitterroot Mountains and darkness settled over the valley, the farmhouse stood quiet. No whispers. No cold drafts. No radios turning on by themselves. Just a house. Just a cellar with sunlight filtering through broken boards, illuminating empty space where terrible secrets had once been buried. Just a Japanese maple tree with leaves turning crimson in the autumn air, its roots reaching deep into soil that no longer held anything but the promise of spring. The house had finally spoken its truth. And now, at last, it could rest. Because some homes don't haunt people. They wait for the truth to be unearthed. Ultimately, this story is about persistence. Evidence doesn't disappear. It only waits for someone who knows how to read it. In cases like this, justice depends on meticulous documentation, preserved records, responsible information sharing, and the unwavering belief that truth may be slow, but it is never silent forever. If you believe that no one truly vanishes while the truth still searches for them, subscribe to the channel to join us on this continuing journey exploring cold cases across North America. Thank you for following the story of James and Rebecca Turner. See you in the next episode where another buried secret waits to be unearthed.